I know that just as my death is inevitable, so also is my resurrection from the dead. This is the hope that we as people who love Jesus have. This evening we're in Genesis 35 verses 16 through 29, so finishing up this last section of Genesis chapter 35, indeed wrapping up what it seems to be is much of the life of Jacob. From this point on, the narrative is really going to start to take a turn. That is, the historical narrative is going to really start to take a turn and focus on the sons of Israel, on the children of Israel, the 12 tribes, the tribal heads of the children of Israel. And we'll begin to focus in the coming months on Joseph, who was sold into slavery in Egypt. But tonight we begin to look at the end of Jacob's life as some of the things in his life come to a close, come to an end. We've walked with Jacob for some time now, from the time where he was born all the way to now where he's going to bury a wife and he's going to bury a father. He's already buried a woman that would have been somewhat of a grandmother to him, Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, earlier in this chapter. What I want to see here tonight, what I think is so obvious in this passage tonight is essentially that there are 4 inevitable aspects of life. There are at least 4 inevitable aspects of life that are shown to us in this passage. May not seem like much at the beginning, but you see a man go through, the mountaintop highs of life, and in just a few more verses, in fact, even in the same verse, he goes down to the pits of life. He has a son born in one verse, and then in the same verse, he has his beloved wife die. He has a son betray him and sin against him in such a heinous and a perverted way. And then he ends up with his brother reconciled, but they're reconciled and now they're burying daddy together. These are just inevitable aspects of life. These are things that all of us deal with. And so what I want to do is focus your attention really on one overarching truth. Before we get to those inevitable aspects of life, I want to point you to one overarching truth, and it's simply this: the faithfulness of God will carry us through all the aspects of life. The faithfulness of God will carry us through all the aspects of life. God is faithful to us in the joyful times. He's faithful to us in extreme sorrow. He is faithful towards us when we are deeply wounded. And He is faithful to us when we encounter and are so vulnerable to the brevity of life. God is faithful to us in every aspect of our lives. So let's look at the passage here. I'm just going to look at really 3 sections, and then I'll point your attention at the very end to those 4 aspects of life. The first section we'll look at is verses 16 through 21. That's the birth of Benjamin and the death of Rachel, verses 16 through 21. Verses 22 through 26, you'll see the incest of Reuben and the sons of Jacob. The incest of Reuben, and then the listing of the legacy, the sons of Jacob. And then in the last section, verses 27 through 29, you're going to see the death of Isaac. The death and burial of Isaac. Let's look at that first section together, verses 16 through 21. It says this in verse 16: Then they journeyed from Bethel. They journeyed from Bethel. You remember last week we saw the episode where Jacob had finally been brought by the Lord's faithfulness all the way back to the place where he began. When he was preparing to leave the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, the land of promise, to go to the far country, to Padan Aram, to escape his brother's wrath, he arrived there at Bethel first. And that's where the Lord appeared to him. That's where he had the vision of the ladder that ascended to heaven and the angels of God ascending and descending. And the Lord promised him. The Lord said, I will never leave you, nor will I forsake you. I will bring you back into this land. And Jacob said, if you will do that, if you'll give me food to eat, clothes to wear, if you'll protect me, and if you will bring me back into this land, you will be my God. Not just the God of Abraham and Isaac, you will be the God of Jacob. You will be my God, and I will worship you, and I will give you a full tenth of everything that I have. And so after 20 some odd years of Jacob's sojourn in the far country, the Lord brings him back safely, and he comes right back to where the Lord told him, I will bring you here. It's an extreme example of the faithfulness of God seen over the lifetime of a man. We drew out the truth last week that the faithful God demands the fullness of our devotion. The faithful God demands the fullness of our devotion, and that's what Jacob offers him. Jacob makes the altar. It is assumed in the passage that you sacrifice on an altar. Jacob offers a tenth of all that he has, and then he commemorates the site. You remember? He builds a pillar there, and he commemorates the site so that all of the generations coming after him would remember that in Bethel, the Lord God, the Lord Jehovah, appeared to Jacob. Now they are leaving Bethel, and they're traveling south. Bethel, or we could say Bethel as we would say it in English. Bethel is just to the north of Jerusalem. And so as Jacob and his family leave Bethel, they start to travel south, seemingly going around Jerusalem, which would have been occupied at that point by the Jebusites. It was not called Jerusalem, it was called Jebus. Occupied by the Jebusites. It wouldn't get the name Jerusalem or the city of David until many hundreds of years later when David would conquer that city. So they go around the city and they come south about 15 miles south of Jerusalem with the Dead Sea on their east, and they come to Ephrath. It says, then they journeyed, verse 16 of Genesis 35, then they journeyed from Bethel. When they were still some distance from Ephrath, Rachel went into labor. Ephrath is the region right there around Bethlehem. You recall the name Ephrath of Bethlehem Ephratah. Bethlehem Ephratah. It says in Micah chapter 5, verse 2, this is why this sounds so familiar to you. Micah chapter 5, verse 2 says this, we read it at Christmas all the time. But you, O Bethlehem Ephratah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah. From you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient days. And where was Jesus born? Jesus is born in Bethlehem Ephratah. That's where he is born, or Bethlehem Ephrath. And so there's still some distance from Ephrath, and something terrible happens here, and something wonderful. It says, while they were still some distance from Ephrath, Rachel, Jacob's beloved wife, Rachel went into labor. She had hard labor. And when her labor was at its hardest, the midwife said to her, do not fear, for you have another son. And as her soul was departing, for she was dying, she called his name Ben-Oni, but his father called him Benjamin. So Rachel died. And we'll stop there for just a moment. So as they're traveling, Rachel goes into labor. Kind of reminiscent of Mary being fully pregnant as they are traveling to Bethlehem. And they get there in time to be able to go off into a barn and have Jesus. Now Rachel, many, many thousands of years beforehand, they're almost there to Bethlehem, they're almost to Ephrath, but before they get there, she goes into hard labor. This woman, these women in these days, they didn't have doctors like we have, they didn't have the anesthetics like we have, they were going through this on their own. They had midwives, which must have been extremely skilled at what they were doing to help these women give birth out there really in the wilderness. Rachel, she'd given birth to one son before, that son being Joseph. You recall that Joseph is the beloved son of Jacob. Later on, we'll see that Jacob dotes on his son by Rachel because Rachel is the wife of his love. So he loves Joseph dearly. He loves Rachel dearly, and he seems to just kind of put up with the other three women and sons. She goes into hard labor, and as she's having the baby, you hear what the midwife says, don't fear. You have another son. You've accomplished your task here. You've accomplished, and you think about this. I just want to celebrate the way God has made women for a moment. What an incredible thing that God has made women with the ability to bear children into this world. That is an absolutely miraculous, incredible, courageous, difficult feat that a woman completes by giving birth to a child. And here's Rachel doing it on the road, essentially, as her family is sojourning through the land. The midwife says, don't fear. You have another son. You have completed your task. This is the work that God made you for. God made you to bear children into the world. In fact, the promise of God tells us in Genesis 3, the promise of God. He tells Eve that it is through the bearing of children that God is going to bring salvation into the world. He told Eve that it was the offspring. It was her offspring that would crush the head of the serpent. And so Rachel's completing her task here. And as says in verse 18, as her soul was departing, such a poetic way to say it, for she was dying, she called his name Ben-Oni. Ben, or Bain, would be the way you would say it in Hebrew. It means son of. Anytime you see that prefix Bain, it means son of. And then you'll see a suffix or a combination to the end of that word, and it also has a meaning. Ben-Oni sounds like the word that would have meant son of my sorrows, son of my labors, son of my difficulty and my struggle. Rachel is deeply affected, obviously, by what she's going through here in the moment. She hasn't had an easy life. She's had to compete with her sister Leah and then also the two maidservants. She's had to compete with being barren for most of her married life. She's had to compete with all kinds of struggles in her life. But now she gives birth to a son, and she says, he's son of my sorrows. She knows that she's dying. But see what Jacob does. Jacob seemingly corrects her. He's not going to have his son named Sorrowful, and so he names him Benjamin, son of my strength, son of my power, son of my right hand is literally what it means. The right hand would have been the hand of strength. It would have been the hand of favor. Which hand of God is Jesus sitting on? He is seated at the right hand of God. He's seated at the hand of favor, the hand of strength, and the hand of power. Benjamin will be the son. He will be the young son that Jacob will refuse to allow to go to Egypt. He wants to protect Benjamin. He's fearful. He's already lost Joseph. He will not let Benjamin go. He is a favored son, and you'll see him protect him. But Benjamin actually, he ends up prophetically fulfilling both of these names, son of my sorrow and son of my strength. Listen to Genesis 49, the commentary, the blessing that Jacob issues over Benjamin at the end of Jacob's life. Genesis 49, verse 27 says this, Benjamin is a ravenous wolf, in the morning devouring the prey, and at evening dividing the spoil. Benjamin's legacy would be both one of strength and one of causing sorrow and of grief. We'll get into that later as we go further in the Bible. Now, let's look, continuing on here. It says, verse 19, so Rachel died, and she was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is, Bethlehem. So Rachel died, it says. She's buried there in Ephrath in Bethlehem. You recall in Matthew chapter 2, when Herod had sent the wise men from the east, they came to Herod first and they said, where is he who is to be born king of the Jews? And Herod says, you tell me. You come back and you tell me. And so the wise men from the east, they go and they find the child. And then the Lord appears to the wise men and says, don't go back to Herod. So they go the long way around and they return to their homeland. When Herod figures out that he has been tricked and he's been deceived, the Bible says in Matthew 2 that he was thrown into a fury and he's thrown into a rage. And he gives out the decree that all of the children, all of the male children, 2 years old and younger, be put to death. And there is a massive abortion-like slaughter in the land of Bethlehem, Ephratah. And in Matthew chapter 2, it says that it is a fulfillment of a prophecy in Jeremiah chapter 31, where it says that Rachel is mourning for her children. Rachel is weeping from the ground. Where is Rachel buried? She's buried in Bethlehem, Ephratah. That's where she dies. That's where she is buried. And now, as she is a figurehead of the mother of the children of Israel, that's the way that she is viewed. Her children, which are slaughtered in Bethlehem later on, she's figuratively weeping over them. It says in verse 20, and Jacob set up a pillar over her tomb. He wants people to remember God is going to make a mighty nation out of Rachel. She's going to be a massive figure in the people of Israel. He set up a pillar over her tomb. It is the pillar of Rachel's tomb and is there to this day. It is there to this day. You say, well, what is this day? Is it today? Well, I don't know exactly where it is today, but I know that when this was written, it was there. When the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, guess what? The pillar over Rachel's tomb was still there. In fact, in 1 Samuel chapter 10, when Samuel the prophet is set out by the Lord to anoint Saul as king over the people of Israel, you know where he tells Saul to meet him? He says, meet me at Rachel's tomb. So Saul meets him there at Rachel's tomb, and Samuel anoints him king over Israel. It is the pillar of Rachel's tomb, it says in verse 20, which is there to this day. Israel journeyed on, that's Jacob's new name, you remember. Israel journeyed on and pitched his tent beyond the tower of Eder. Migdal Eder is the way that the Hebrew is phrased. It doesn't necessarily mean tower. It means Migdal Eder. A literal translation would mean tower of the flock. Tower of the flock. You can read about that on your own, but archaeological studies tell us that the tower of the flock, or Migdal Eder, is somewhere right there around Bethlehem, Ephratah. It says in verse 22 down through 26, look at this. Terrible, terrible event. Jacob has already experienced a terrible event, hasn't he? Sure, he's had the joy of a son being born, the son of his strength. He's also son of his sorrow, because he's experienced the death of his wife. Now, it would have been tragic if any of his wives had died, but this is Rachel who died. Rachel's the one he wanted to marry from the very beginning, and now he's lost her. Look at verse 22. While Israel lived in that land, so he's somewhere right around Hebron. It's going to tell you later on in verse 27. While Israel lived in that land, Reuben, his firstborn by Leah, went and lay with Bilhah, that's Rachel's maidservant, his father's concubine. And Israel heard of it. Here's Reuben, the oldest of Jacob's sons. And now that Rachel has died, Rachel's servant, Bilhah, she's considered to be a concubine. Now, just a definition of what a concubine would have been in a polygamous society where you have multiple wives. A concubine would have been a woman who is in the home, who bears children to the progenitor, to the father of the household, but she's not considered a wife. She's considered of a lower status than a wife. And so Bilhah would likely have not been respected by Reuben. Reuben is a son of Leah. Reuben is the oldest son. There are some commentators who actually say that Reuben's actions here of sleeping with essentially his stepmother was actually something that a conquering king would do in order to subvert his predecessor. That conquering king would go into the harem of the previous king, and he would sleep with those wives of that previous king. And in that way, he would subvert his authority. He would subvert his kingdom. There's some commentators that say Reuben's action is not just one of betrayal in a sexual sense, but that it was actually a betrayal in an authoritarian sense. He was trying to take leadership of the home. He sees the beloved wife dead, and he seizes his opportunity, or so it would seem. So Reuben is the eldest, and he takes Bilhah being Rachel's maidservant, and he goes into her. And it says, and Israel heard of it. And that's the end of the matter for all we know at this point. That's all we know at this point. That Israel heard of it. There's no theological commentary. There's no moral judgment that is made. When we read that, the intended response of any human being would be, that's disgusting. That is a perversion of the way God created mankind to function. Later on, God's laws, which are written on our heart, were given there to Moses to canonize the fact that some of these things like this should never happen. Things such as this. Let me read a few passages just to make it clear that incest of any kind is not permitted in God's law. Leviticus 18, verse 6. None of you shall approach any one of his close relatives to uncover nakedness. I am the Lord. Leviticus 18, verse 8. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is your father's nakedness. The same command is repeated twice, Deuteronomy 22 and Deuteronomy chapter 27. And the idea here of uncovering the nakedness of your father, when you sleep with your father's wife, is this, that they have become one flesh. That a husband and a wife, when they come together intimately, that they have become one flesh. And so to uncover one of their nakednesses is to uncover the other as well. And that is a shameful, abominable perversion. And Israel heard of it. Jacob heard of it. The commentary that Jacob gives to Reuben in a blessing, which doesn't seem like so much of a blessing, this prophetic utterance at the end of Jacob's life, listen to what he says about Reuben. Genesis chapter 49, verses 3 through 4. He says, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the firstfruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. Unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch. There's Jacob at the end of his life, and he didn't only hear of it many years ago, he remembered it. This wound struck him so deeply that he bore that wound to his grave. That's how much it hurt him. That when he is blessing his sons, he actually begins screaming about this event. Who knows, maybe Jacob had held his peace up until that moment. But it didn't only cause strife and division between a son and a father, it also created a problem for Reuben's descendants. You know, our sins, the consequences of them can carry over to our children. If we act poorly, it's not just we who have a problem before God. Our kids may in fact bear the brunt of the consequences of our bad decisions. If we're a bad father, guess what? We're going to answer for that before the Lord. But who's going to bear the brunt of it? It's the children. Reuben's actions never hurt just himself. And that's what we need to remember about sin. A lot of times we think sin, the damage that is caused by sin, is more like sniper fire. That we can kind of direct the damage, and I can do this sin over here, and I know who it's going to hurt. It's only going to hurt me. I'm the one that's going to know about it, and I'll deal with God on another date because the Lord's gracious and slow to anger. But sin is not like sniper fire. Sin is much more like a grenade. Sin it sends shrapnel everywhere. And it hits people indiscriminately. It causes damage that we never intended for it to cause, but it causes it nonetheless. Look at the consequences here for Reuben's sin. 1 Chronicles Chapter 5, verse 1. Reuben actually ends up having to forfeit his right of inheritance. He is the firstborn. He gets a double inheritance. And because of his sin of betrayal and perversion, he loses it. In this sense, he's no different than Esau. Sold his birthright for the bowl of pottage, for the bowl of red beans. 1 Chronicles 5:1, the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, for he was firstborn, but because he defiled his father's couch, it's his bed, his birthright was given to the sons of who? The sons of Joseph, the beloved son of Rachel. Was given to the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel, so that he could not be enrolled as the oldest son. Joseph being the favorite son, the son of his beloved Rachel, Joseph actually ends up getting a double portion. He ends up receiving the firstborn's inheritance. That's why when you read of the 12 tribes of Israel, you don't read of Joseph. You read of two other tribes, his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. He has a double portion, and Reuben loses his. Look at verse 23. Actually, the second part of verse 22, it says, now the sons of Jacob were 12. This is going to be the first complete listing of the 12 tribes of Israel. The sons of Jacob were 12. The sons of Leah, Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel, Joseph, and Benjamin. The sons of Bilhah, Rachel's servant, Dan and Naphtali. The sons of Zilpah, Leah's servant, Gad and Asher. These were the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Padan Aram. Now you'll see it later, actually in the next chapter, Genesis 36, is the expansion of Esau's descendants. His sons and their sons and their sons. And then in Genesis 37, you will see a record of the descendants of Israel just as well. But preeminently, the Lord once announced the 12 sons of Israel. This is an evidence of the fulfillment of God's promises, isn't it? When Jacob set out from Bethel all those years ago, he went there and he had no descendants. He had no property. And yet he comes back from his sojourn into Padan Aram, and he comes back and now he has 12 sons. I don't even have that. I tried to number. I don't have that many fingers. He has 12 sons. And those 12 sons are going to be the seed that's going to bear out descendants that number as the sands of the seashore and as the stars of the sky in fulfillment of the command or the promises that God gave Abraham and Isaac and then also to Jacob. Now, you think Jacob's got a lot to celebrate there. But you remember that Jacob's joy here, his pride in life is also intermixed with sorrow, isn't it? When he thinks about his boys, his 12 sons, you got to remember, he's going to remember for the rest of his life the wounds of Reuben. He's also going to remember for the rest of his life the wounds that Simeon and Levi brought about when they killed all of the males there in Shechem. Joy, sorrow, intermingled. That's the way life is. Look here at verse 27 through 29. The death and the burial of Isaac. It says, and Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre, or Kiriath Arba. These are just two alternate names for the real name. That is Hebron. Hebron is almost 20 miles even directly south of Jerusalem. It's 5 more miles south than Bethlehem. That's where Abraham and Isaac had sojourned. Now, the days of Isaac were 180 years. Of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Isaac was actually the one who lived the longest. He lived longer than Abraham, who lived 175 years. Jacob lived somewhere between 130 to 150, maybe 160 years. He didn't live nearly as long as his father Isaac. It says in verse 29, and Isaac breathed his last, and he died and was gathered to his people, old and full of days. And his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. Oh, what a sad way to end the chapter. You know, there's actually more record of Isaac. Isaac actually lived at least 12 years after Joseph was sold into Egypt. But a lot of times this is the way that history would record. It records the big events. And then it tells us all the little events and the micro narratives. But right here, we see that both Jacob and Esau, they joined together, hand in hand, to bury their father. Funerals have a way of bringing families together, at least for a time. You have a family reunion, but again, you've got joy, sorrow mixed together. We all know this. That's why we nod our head, especially the older we get, we nod our head in agreement because we've seen it time and time again. These are inevitable aspects of life. Listen to the way, because these are big events in Jacob's life. You know, after Jacob and his family come into Egypt, Jacob sits down with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, when he's 130 years old. He sits down with Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, "How old are you?" Listen to Jacob. Genesis 48, verse 9. That's how Jacob characterizes his life. And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my sojourning are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life. And they have not attained to the days of the years of my fathers in the days of their sojournings." He says, few and evil have been the days of the years of my life. He lived to be more than 130 years old. I said, man, he has got a long life. His life was full of bitterness. I would imagine if we each took an honest survey of our lives, and we started to look back at the years of our lives, we would say of our lives, the days of the years of our lives have been few and have been filled with evil. There have been sorrow, there's been heartache, there have been wounds. Those wounds still cut me deeply. Few and evil. Let me point you to three aspects, three big aspects, inevitable aspects of our life. And then I'll point you to a fourth. Aspect number one, if you want to write this down, you know it. You don't even have to write it down. It's inevitable. We will all experience the joys of life. All of us. That is a grace of God, isn't it? That we will all experience the joys of life. We experience those mountaintops where, man, it's a mountaintop experience when you graduate the second grade, isn't it? Or, we have the preschool graduation, and man, they're walking down in their regalia, and they're so excited, and I'm looking at them going, you've got all kinds of education left to go through. But man, they're so pumped. Mountaintop experience. But then you get there to kindergarten, and it's a rude awakening, right? You don't have a rude awakening in kindergarten, but you know what I mean. You have these highs, and then you have these lows. Every one of us gets to experience the joys of life. Waking up on a Saturday and realizing you don't have anything to do. Anybody know what that's like? Y'all are forgetting, aren't you? I see y'all started working a few years ago. Now you forget. I don't remember what it's like to not have anything to do. But man, when you do get that one day, just to rest and just to sleep, and you say, hey, let's grill some steaks, let's have a good time. You get to experience joy. You get to experience the birth of a niece or a nephew, the birth of your own child. You get to experience seeing the child succeed in things and learn things. I went up there, I heard a voice from above last night. Josiah went up the upstairs. He's living upstairs now. He's graduated. And I heard a voice. I had told him, I said, I need you and Eli, go to your rooms and read your Bibles. And I want you to pray. And I'm walking through the house, and I hear a voice. He's not reading in his heart, he's reading out loud. And so I walk up there, and he's reading John chapter 3. Reading every word and working his way through it. And man, I was like, man, I want to go and lay down myself, but I'm not missing this. This is a mountaintop. This is joy. I went there, I sat next to him, and I just listened to him, and I said, hey, why don't you lead prayer tonight? And without any prompting, here's Josiah. He walks us through completely, verbatim, word for word, the Lord's Prayer. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. I mean, man, it could well up. I'm trying to hold it back and well up in tears right now. Man, such a high. such a joy. We all get to experience the joys of life. Aspect number 2, we will all endure the sorrows of this life. We experience the joys of getting to go see Grandma and Grandpa, and then we go see Grandma and Grandpa when they pass. And it's not so joy-filled, is it? It's sorrowful. But oftentimes when you go to a Grandma or Grandpa's funeral, there's also a bunch of little babies around, aren't there? You've got this intermixing of this joy and this sorrow. That's what Jacob went through. He goes through a mixing of spices that don't work. He's got the sorrow of burying his wife, his beloved wife, and also the joy of a brand new son, Benjamin. He probably weeps for joy and weeps in mourning at the same time. Life's full of the sorrows that we all experience. I don't have to go into that very much. We know what that's like. We know what it's like to get that bonus we weren't expecting or to get a check in the mail we weren't expecting. We also know what it's like for a charge to hit our account that we didn't know was coming. Right? Sorrows. Aspect number 3. We will all receive wounds in this life. When you think back on the days of your life, you might think about the joys that you've had. You might think of the sorrows that you've had. But interspersed in between there is the wounds that people have inflicted on you. Or maybe you've inflicted on yourself. Maybe you've said something, you've done something, and you know what? You just can't ever take it back. Oh, and it may have healed. The rift may have been healed, but we know when our bodies are wounded, even though they heal, there's scars left over. And it's like this. From all those years of playing baseball and throwing, and I wounded the inside of my elbow. It doesn't hurt right now. It doesn't hurt right now at all. But you know what? The next time a front blows in and the pressures outside change, I'm going to feel it. I'm literally going to feel the pains of that torture I put my arm through. I will feel those pains in my bones. Many of you know exactly what I'm talking about. But think about the wounds that are in your heart. A certain cold wind blows of a memory, and what happens in your heart? It's almost like you're taken right back to that very moment that the event happened. And you feel it all over again. And maybe you get mad because of the wound. Maybe you get furious. Maybe you're just overwhelmed and you weep for a minute. Maybe you just say, I just don't want to talk about it right now. I'm not having a good day. Wounds. We'll all experience and receive wounds in this life. But remember, I pointed you to the faithfulness of God. I told you there at the beginning, the faithfulness of God will carry us through all the aspects of life. The joys, the sorrows, the wounds. Listen to how the psalmist wrote it. I can't say it better than this. Psalm 103, verses 13 through 18. I use this often when I preach funerals. It says this, as a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him. For he knows our frame. He remembers that we are dust. As for man, his days are like grass. He flourishes like a flower of the field, for the wind passes over it, and it is gone, and its place knows it no more. But the steadfast love of the Lord is from everlasting to everlasting, to those who fear him, and his righteousness to children's children, to those who keep his covenant and remember to do his commandments. Here's the Lord. Through our joys and our sorrows and our wounds, here he is. Always being compassionate. Always carrying us through it. Why? Because he knows our frame. He knows how we were formed because he's the one that did it. He knows that we were made of dust. And that when this feeble life is over, we'll return back to the dirt. The Lord knows that there are many things that we just can't handle. We can't handle too much of it or else we'll perish. But that kind of brings us to that fourth inevitable aspect of life, doesn't it? We will all be seized by the brevity of life. All of us. We will all be seized by the brevity of life. Every one of us. We say it as though it were cliche, but cliches are that way because they're true. It's true that every one of us will have a funeral, and none of us are going to expect that day. We will all be seized. I chose that word very carefully because this seizure that we undergo, it's involuntary. We're just grabbed by it, not planning on it, not wanting it to happen, but we're grabbed like a fugitive that just got arrested, and we don't get out. We're just seized by the brevity of life. Our life is short. That's what the psalmist was just saying a moment ago, right? That the sons of men, that we are like grass. We spring up really quick, we flourish for a moment, and the next day we're blown off. And we're gone. And we think about our lives in very arrogant ways. We think arrogantly about tomorrow, even though we don't know what tomorrow will bring, or if we will even be here tomorrow. We think that we're all going to become old and gray, and that's just not the reality. Not everybody in this room is going to become old and gray. And all of us will die at a time we did not plan. I think very mournfully right now. You know, I grew up. I grew up watching Kobe Bryant play basketball. Man, never seen. I grew up watching Michael Jordan towards the end of his life, but then I really started watching Kobe Bryant. He was a few years ahead of me. He's 41 or was 41. I'm 33. So he's already gone through high school. I was watching his high school reruns when I was coming up through high school, and I was trying to imitate him playing basketball. And man, he was just somebody we all looked up to. And you wouldn't have ever thought that Kobe Bryant would die at 41. I don't know the day of my death, but I do know that it's inevitable. I know that it's coming. But here's the thing. It's interesting to see people process the death of someone like Kobe Bryant because it's so public. And you see people's public comments about it, and you see people try to cope with it and try to understand, and you see so many people in despair because they just can't make sense of it. It caught them so off guard, and you can tell that people aren't prepared. This is why it is so crucial to put your faith in Jesus today. Because we just don't know when, but we do all know that it's inevitable. We know that it's coming. And this is the truth, that when we put our faith in Jesus, God has promised us, as a sure and steady anchor of our soul, God has promised to forgive us of our sins. He has promised to give us everlasting life. He's promised to raise us up from our grave. And because of that, we can have hope. I can know that my death is inevitable, and I can rejoice with hope. I know that just as I died with Christ, I know that I will also be raised with Christ. I know that just as my death is inevitable, so also is my resurrection from the dead. This is the hope that we as people who love Jesus have. Listen to this. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 through 9. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to His great mercy, He has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you, who by God's power are being guarded through faith. You're being guarded through faith. God is using His power to put faith in your heart and keep you trusting in Him. You are being guarded through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, sorrows, joys, wounds, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him, and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. I don't know how to get through these inevitable aspects of life without faith in the Lord. In fact, I just don't think that I could. It's the faithfulness of God that carries us through all the aspects of life. Would you pray with me?